There is a disease that quietly builds up inside a person for 30, 40, even 50 years without a single warning sign. It does not come from bad food. It does not come from alcohol. It does not come from anything the person did wrong. It comes from one tiny spelling mistake inside a single gene, a mistake that was copied and passed down through more than 200 generations, all the way back to one person who lived in Western Europe thousands of years ago. That person had no idea what they were starting. They lived, they had children, and inside those children was a copy of a mutation that would eventually travel across an entire continent and end up inside millions of people alive today. Scientists eventually traced this mutation back through the DNA of modern patients, through old church records, through ancient bones, and through population maps, and what they found pointed again and again to one place: Ireland. This is the story of how a single ancestor, living thousands of years before anyone wrote a word of history, left behind a genetic time bomb that still goes off in people today, and how doctors finally figured out where it came from and why it spread so far. If you enjoy stories about how our DNA still carries the fingerprints of people who lived thousands of years ago, stay with me, because this one connects ancient migration, a hidden disease, and a piece of detective work that took scientists almost a century to fully solve. Let's start with the disease itself, because understanding what it does to the body is the only way to understand why it stayed hidden for so long. The condition is called hereditary hemochromatosis, and in plain language it means the body cannot stop absorbing iron. A healthy person eats food containing iron. The intestine takes in just enough to replace what the body loses through normal daily wear, and the rest is left alone. It is a tightly controlled system, almost like a thermostat, that switches absorption on and off depending on how much iron the body already has stored. But in someone with this condition, that thermostat is broken. The intestine keeps pulling in iron from food no matter how much is already stored in the liver, the heart, the joints, and the pancreas. There's no dial to turn down. Every meal adds a little more iron than the body needs, and none of it gets removed naturally because the human body has almost no way to get rid of extra iron once it is inside. At first, nothing seems wrong. A person with this condition can look completely healthy through their 20s and 30s. Iron builds up slowly, almost invisibly, milligram by milligram, year after year. By the time a person reaches their 40s or 50s, the extra iron has often been sitting inside their organs for decades, quietly rusting them from the inside, in almost the same way a piece of metal left out in the rain slowly turns orange and crumbles. The liver is usually hit first, because it is the body's main iron storage site, and it can become scarred and damaged, sometimes to the point of failure. The heart muscle can absorb so much iron that it starts to beat irregularly or weaken. The pancreas can be affected so badly that the person develops diabetes, which is why old medical textbooks sometimes call this disease bronze diabetes, because patients would develop diabetes along with a strange bronze or gray tint to their skin caused by iron deposits just under the surface. Joints can become painful and swollen, especially in the hands, long before any other symptom appears. Fatigue is often the very first thing people notice, a tiredness that does not go away no matter how much they sleep, because their organs are working under constant, invisible stress. For most of history, doctors had no way to explain any of this. A patient would come in with joint pain, unusual tiredness, a darkening of the skin, and abnormal liver readings, and there was no obvious cause. Some patients were told they were simply getting older. Others were misdiagnosed with liver disease from alcohol. Even when they barely drank at all, some were told their diabetes and joint pain were unrelated problems that just happened to appear around the same time. It took doctors many decades to realize that all of these different symptoms in different organs were actually caused by one single underlying problem: an invisible flood of iron building up silently inside the body since childhood. The breakthrough came when researchers finally identified the actual gene responsible. It sits on chromosome 6, one of the 23 pairs of chromosomes that carry all of human DNA, and it is called the HV gene. Under normal conditions, this gene produces a protein that helps the body sense how much iron it already has, almost like a fuel gauge feeding information back to the intestine, so it knows when to stop absorbing more. In people with hereditary hemochromatosis, a tiny mutation changes just one building block in this protein. Where a normal version of the protein has an amino acid called cysteine sitting at a specific position, the mutated version has a different amino acid called tyrosine sitting in that exact same spot instead. Geneticists call this mutation C282Y, and that one swapped letter is enough to break the entire iron sensing system. The fuel gauge stops working properly, and the body just keeps drinking in iron from every meal, as if it were always running low, even when it is dangerously overloaded. This disease is recessive, which means a person needs 2 copies of the mutated gene, one from each parent, to actually develop serious iron overload. If someone inherits only 1 copy, they are called a carrier. Carriers usually stay healthy, or have only mild iron buildup, because their one working copy of the gene is often enough to keep the system mostly under control. But when two carriers have children together, there's a real chance that a child will inherit the mutated copy from both parents and end up with the full condition. This pattern of inheritance is exactly why the disease seemed to appear randomly in families for generations, without anyone understanding the pattern. Two apparently healthy parents could have a child who developed serious organ damage in adulthood, and nobody could explain why, because nobody could see the two hidden mutated genes quietly waiting inside each parent. When researchers finally began mapping out where this mutation showed up across different populations, the results were striking. This exact mutation, this exact single-letter change in this exact gene, was not spread evenly across the world. It was heavily concentrated in one part of the globe. Populations of Northern European background carried it far more often than any other group on Earth. And within that region, one place stood out above every other: Ireland. Studies looking at people of Irish descent found carrier rates far higher than almost anywhere else studied, with some estimates suggesting roughly 1 in 5 people of Irish ancestry carries at least one copy of the mutation, and roughly 1 in 80 to 1 in 150 carries 2 copies, and therefore has the full condition. Compare that to populations in East Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, where this exact mutation is essentially absent, and you start to see a very unusual pattern. This was not a mutation that appeared many times independently in many different places. This looked like something that started in one specific location and then spread outward from there. So scientists asked the obvious question: if this mutation is concentrated so heavily in Ireland and the surrounding Celtic regions of Western Europe, could it have started with one single person long ago whose descendants eventually spread the mutation across an entire population? To answer that, geneticists turn to a tool that works almost like a genetic fingerprint. Whenever a new mutation appears in a single person, it does not appear alone. It shows up attached to a specific stretch of DNA sitting right next to it on the chromosome, a combination of genetic markers called a haplotype. Think of a haplotype as the unique neighborhood of DNA letters surrounding the mutation at the moment it first appeared. If a mutation arose independently in many different people at many different times, you would expect to see many different haplotypes attached to it, because each new copy of the mutation would have appeared inside a different genetic background. But if a mutation came from just one single original event, in just one single ancestor, then almost everyone who carries that mutation today should share the exact same surrounding haplotype, passed down together as a single package through every single generation since. When researchers examined the DNA of people with the C282Y mutation across Europe, they found something remarkable. The vast majority of carriers, no matter where in Europe they lived, shared an almost identical haplotype surrounding the mutation. This was very strong evidence that the mutation did not appear many separate times in many separate places. It arose just once, inside one single person, at one single moment in history, and every single person alive today who carries this exact mutation is, in a very real genetic sense, a descendant of that one original person. Using the length of the shared haplotype block and how much it had been broken up by genetic recombination over generations, researchers were able to estimate roughly how long ago this single founding mutation first appeared. The estimates point to somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 years ago, placing the original mutation deep in prehistoric Europe, long before anything resembling written history, long before the Celtic culture we associate with Ireland even existed as a distinct identity. The best genetic evidence suggests the mutation most likely first appeared somewhere in Western Europe, in a population that was part of the deep ancestral roots of what would later become the Celtic-speaking peoples of Ireland, Britain, and Brittany in modern-day France. Picture that moment for a second. Somewhere in a small farming or herding community, thousands of years before Rome existed, before the pyramids of Egypt were built, before almost anything we consider ancient history had happened yet, one single person was born with a tiny copying error in their HFE gene. They likely never knew anything was different about them. They almost certainly lived a completely normal life, ate what everyone else ate, worked the land the way everyone else did, and had children the way everyone else did. But hidden inside their cells was a single genetic accident that would eventually be carried by millions of people scattered across an entire continent, all without any of them ever meeting each other, most of them never even knowing the mutation was there at all. From that single starting point, the mutation began its slow spread outward, carried inside families as they had children, as those children moved to new villages, married into new families, and had children of their own. Over dozens of generations, the mutation gradually became more and more common within certain populations. And this is where the genetics connects directly to real human history, to actual migrations that we know happened. The regions where this mutation shows up most today, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany and France, and parts of England, are the same regions where Celtic-speaking cultures took root and remained strongest for the longest period of time. As Celtic populations moved and settled across these areas over thousands of years, they carried the mutation with them. And because these communities often remained relatively separate from other groups for long stretches of history, the mutation had the chance to become unusually common within them, generation after generation, without being diluted the way it might have been in a larger, more mixed population. This is actually why medical researchers nicknamed hereditary hemochromatosis the Celtic Curse, or the Celtic disease, long before they fully understood its genetic origin. Doctors working in Ireland and other Celtic regions noticed for decades that this particular pattern of iron overload showed up in their patients far more often than in patients from other parts of Europe, long before anyone could explain exactly why. The nickname turned out to be more accurate than the doctors who coined it could have possibly known, because DNA evidence would later prove that the disease really did trace back through a genetic thread running directly through Celtic ancestry, all the way back to that single ancient founder. But this raises another important question, one that scientists spent years trying to answer. If this mutation causes such serious problems, damaging the liver, the heart, and the pancreas, why did it not simply disappear over thousands of years, the way most harmful mutations eventually do? Evolution is usually ruthless about removing mutations that cause serious illness because people who become seriously ill often have fewer children, and the mutation naturally fades out of the population over time. Yet this particular mutation not only survived, it became remarkably common in certain regions. Something must have been protecting it, giving carriers of the mutation some kind of survival advantage that outweighed the risk of the disease. One of the leading explanations involves the way this mutation behaves differently in carriers than in people with 2 full copies. Remember, most of the damage from hereditary hemochromatosis happens slowly over many decades, often not causing serious problems until well into middle age or later in life, long after most people in ancient societies would have already had children and passed on their genes. For thousands of years, average life expectancy in most human populations was far shorter than it is today. Many people never lived long enough for iron overload to become life-threatening in the first place. This alone would have allowed the mutation to spread relatively unchecked, simply because it did not usually kill people before they had already reproduced. But researchers believe there may have been something more actively beneficial happening as well, particularly for people who carried just 1 copy of the mutation rather than 2. Carriers with a single copy tend to absorb iron slightly more efficiently than people with no copies at all, without developing the severe overload seen in those with 2 copies. In eras where diets were often low in iron, where famine and food shortages were common, where blood loss from childbirth, injury, and infection was a constant danger, having a body that was slightly more efficient at pulling iron out of every meal could have been a real survival advantage. Iron deficiency causes serious fatigue, weakness, and complications during pregnancy and childbirth, and in ancient communities living through frequent famine and disease, a genetic edge that helped the body hold onto iron a little more tightly could plausibly have helped carriers survive hardships that killed off people without that advantage. This is very similar in principle to how certain other harmful mutations have persisted in human populations, because they offered a hidden benefit under specific historical conditions, the same underlying evolutionary logic that keeps other so-called disease mutations alive in a population for thousands of years. There is also a theory connecting this mutation to how the body fights certain infections. Iron is not just important for humans. It is also something that many disease-causing bacteria and parasites need in order to multiply. Some researchers have proposed that certain immune responses involve deliberately lowering iron availability in the blood as a way of starving out invading pathogens. A body with the C282Y mutation, which struggles to properly regulate iron, might behave differently during infection than a body with the normal gene, possibly offering some protection during outbreaks of specific infectious diseases that swept through ancient and medieval Europe. This idea is still being studied and is not fully settled, but it adds another possible piece to the puzzle of why this mutation managed to spread and persist for thousands of years in specific regions, instead of quietly disappearing the way most harmful mutations eventually do. Whatever the exact mix of reasons, the outcome is clear in the genetic record we can study today. A mutation that began with 1 single person in ancient Western Europe managed to spread widely enough that it now affects the health of millions of people, descended from that same regional population, particularly people whose ancestry traces back to Ireland and the wider Celtic world. And because so many people of Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and Breton descent emigrated to other parts of the world over the past few centuries, especially to North America, Australia, and other regions during periods of famine and mass migration, this originally regional mutation is now found scattered across the globe wherever people of Celtic ancestry settled, even though it began in one small population thousands of years before any of those later migrations took place. This detective story did not end once scientists identified the gene and traced its origin. It also completely changed how the disease is diagnosed and managed today, because once doctors understood the genetic cause, they could develop simple blood tests to detect it directly rather than waiting for organ damage to appear decades later. A basic blood test can measure how saturated a person's blood is with iron, and genetic testing can directly check for the C282Y mutation, allowing doctors to identify people who carry the mutation, sometimes even before any symptoms have appeared at all. This matters enormously because treatment for hereditary hemochromatosis, once identified, is remarkably simple and effective. The main treatment is something almost shockingly old-fashioned in an age of advanced medicine, regular bloodletting, now called therapeutic phlebotomy. By regularly removing blood, the same way a blood donation works, doctors force the body to use its excess stored iron to produce new red blood cells, gradually pulling the dangerous iron levels back down toward normal. Patients who are diagnosed early and stick with regular treatment can often live completely normal lives, with the same life expectancy as anyone else, simply by managing their iron levels through routine blood removal for the rest of their lives. The tragedy is that so many people are never tested at all, especially if they have no idea their family has any connection to this ancient inherited mutation, and by the time symptoms finally force a diagnosis, permanent organ damage has often already occurred. This is part of why understanding the genetic history of this condition matters far beyond simple scientific curiosity. Knowing that this mutation is heavily concentrated in people of Irish and broader Celtic ancestry gives doctors and patients real, practical information. Someone with Irish, Scottish, Welsh, or Breton family background, especially anyone with a family history of unexplained liver problems, joint pain, fatigue, or diabetes, has a genuine medical reason to ask about testing for this specific mutation long before symptoms become severe. A disease that once quietly damaged people's organs for decades without explanation can now, in many cases, be caught early enough to prevent almost all of the serious harm it used to cause, all because researchers were finally able to trace it back through the genetic record to a single ancient origin point. There is something almost humbling about the entire story when you step back and look at the full picture. A single person, born somewhere in Western Europe more than 4,000 years ago, someone who left behind no name, no written record, no monument, no memory of any kind, still managed to leave an unmistakable mark on the world that survives to this very day, not through anything they built or accomplished, but simply through the DNA passed down inside their own body to their children and their children's children across roughly 200 generations. That person's descendants scattered across Ireland, Britain, and continental Europe, then later across the entire world during the great migrations of the past few centuries, all while unknowingly carrying a tiny piece of that original person's biology inside them. Millions of people alive, right now, many of whom have probably never even heard the words hereditary hemochromatosis, are walking around today with a direct genetic link to one single human being who lived and died in complete anonymity thousands of years before history began being written down. It is also a powerful reminder of just how deeply human migration and ancestry are written into our biology, whether we are aware of it or not. Every population on Earth carries its own collection of inherited quirks like this one, some helpful, some harmful, some completely neutral, each one telling a story about where that population's ancestors came from, what challenges they survived, and what genetic accidents happened to spread successfully through their family lines over thousands of years. The story of this particular mutation happens to be unusually well documented, thanks to modern genetic tools that let researchers trace it all the way back to a single shared ancestor and a rough time period when that ancestor lived, but it represents something true about every single person's DNA. We are all walking archives of ancient history, carrying inherited traces of people who lived and died long before written records existed, whether those traces show up as something as simple as eye color or something as medically important as the ability or inability to properly regulate the iron flowing through our own blood. So the next time someone mentions Irish ancestry or Celtic heritage or brings up an unexplained family history of liver problems, joint pain, or diabetes that seem to appear out of nowhere across different generations, there's a real chance that the explanation traces back much further than anyone in that family ever imagined, back past written records, past known family trees, past everything anyone alive today could ever hope to remember, all the way to one person living somewhere in ancient Western Europe, whose single genetic accident is still quietly shaping the health of their descendants scattered across the world today.